The Chrysler 426 Hemi was so dominant, NASCAR banned it until Chrysler agreed to sell street versions. The 1957 Chevy fuel-injected 283 got outlawed mid-season for being too fast, and the Porsche 959's twin-turbo flat-six couldn't even get EPA certification. But why did turbine engines nearly destroy American motorsports? How did one Japanese engine earn the nickname Godzilla while being completely illegal? And which band motor was producing over 1,500 horsepower in 1973? These are 10 jaw-dropping engines banned because they were too powerful for America. Number 10. The elephant that NASCAR feared. The Chrysler 426 Hemi earned its elephant nickname not just from its massive size, but from how it absolutely trampled the competition. When Richard Petty's Hemi-powered Plymouth swept the 1964 Daytona 500 with a 1-2-3 finish, NASCAR officials panicked. The engine was producing around 425 horsepower in race trim, but some teams were secretly pushing 500 horses. Ford and Chevy teams complained it was an unfair advantage since Chrysler wasn't selling the engine to the public. NASCAR's solution? Ban it completely for 1965, unless Chrysler made it available in production cars. This forced Chrysler into a corner. They had two choices: abandon their racing program or build street Hemis. They chose option 2, creating the legendary street Hemi that would terrorize American roads. But here's what most people don't know. The street version was actually more powerful than what NASCAR allowed on track. While NASCAR restricted the race engines with smaller carburetors and restrictive exhaust, the street cars came with dual quads pumping out a conservatively rated 425 horsepower. Insurance companies later discovered these engines were actually making closer to 500 horsepower, leading to astronomical premiums that killed sales. The ban backfired spectacularly. By forcing Chrysler to sell street versions, NASCAR accidentally created one of the most legendary muscle car engines in history. Number 9. The fuel injection fiasco. Chevrolet's 1957 fuel-injected 283 cubic inch V8 was decades ahead of its time, and that's exactly why it got banned. While other manufacturers were still perfecting carburetors, Chevy engineers had created a mechanical fuel injection system that produced 1 horsepower per cubic inch, 283 horsepower from 283 cubic inches. This was unheard of in 1957. The system used a complex arrangement of mechanical pumps and metering valves that delivered precise amounts of fuel based on throttle position and engine speed. No carburetor float bowls to slosh around in corners, no fuel starvation under hard acceleration. On the NASCAR superspeedways, this advantage was devastating. The fuel-injected Chevys were walking away from the competition at Daytona, leading by multiple car lengths. Ford and Chrysler screamed bloody murder. They claimed the fuel injection system was too expensive and complex for regular production, making it unfair for competition. NASCAR agreed. Midway through the 1957 season, they banned fuel injection entirely, forcing Chevy to revert to carburetors. The technology wouldn't return to NASCAR for decades. Ironically, the street versions continued to be sold, though at a steep premium. Only 1,530 fuel-injected Corvettes were built in 1957 because the system added $484 to the price, equivalent to about $5,000 today. Most buyers couldn't justify the expense, especially when insurance companies started catching on to just how fast these cars really were. Number 8. The turbocharged terror. The Porsche 959 wasn't just ahead of its time, it was ahead of American regulations. When Porsche unveiled their twin-turbocharged technological tour de force in 1986, it made every other supercar look antiquated. The flat-six engine used sequential turbocharging, water-cooled cylinder heads, and titanium connecting rods to produce 4 horsepower. In an era when a Corvette made 230 horsepower, this was astronomical. But here's where things got complicated. The EPA and DOT took one look at the 959 and essentially said absolutely not. The car lacked basic requirements for U.S. sale like DOT-approved headlights and bumpers. More critically, Porsche refused to provide the 4 cars required for crash testing. Why? Because they only planned to build 337 total, and destroying 4 for testing would mean over 1% of production smashed into walls. The real kicker was the engine itself. The sophisticated twin-turbo system with its complex water cooling arrangement baffled EPA inspectors. They couldn't even figure out how to properly test its emissions. Porsche tried to argue that such a limited production car shouldn't need to meet standard regulations, but American bureaucracy wouldn't budge. This led to the bizarre situation where billionaires like Bill Gates and Paul Allen bought 959s but couldn't legally drive them. Gates's 959 sat in customs for over a decade while he lobbied for change. His efforts eventually led to the show or display law in 1999, which finally allowed certain historically or technologically significant cars to be imported without meeting all safety standards. By then, the 959's technology had filtered down to lesser Porsches, but America had missed out on experiencing the original when it mattered most. Number 7. Godzilla stays in Japan. The Nissan RB26DETT engine earned its Godzilla nickname by destroying everything in its path, but American enthusiasts could only watch from afar. This twin-turbocharged 2.6-liter inline-six powered the R32, R33, and R34 Skyline GTRs to countless racing victories, but it might as well have been science fiction to American buyers. The engine itself was a masterpiece of over-engineering. Individual throttle bodies for each cylinder, parallel twin turbos, and an incredibly strong cast-iron block that could handle absurd amounts of boost. In stock form, it was rated at 276 horsepower due to Japan's gentleman's agreement, but everyone knew that was a joke. Tuners were easily extracting 500, 600, even 1,000 horsepower with basic modifications. So why couldn't Americans buy one? The answer involves a tangled web of regulations. The RB26DETT was never certified for U.S. emission standards, which in the 1990s were becoming increasingly strict. The engine lacked the OBD2 diagnostics required after 1996, and its twin-turbo setup produced emissions characteristics that would have required extensive redesign to meet EPA standards. Nissan looked at the cost of federalizing the engine and the relatively small market for 80,000 Japanese sports cars in America and decided it wasn't worth it. But here's the truly frustrating part. The engine was already designed to meet emission standards in other countries. Australian and European versions proved the RB26DETT could be clean enough for strict regulations. The real issue was the cost of certification specifically for the U.S. market. This created an entire underground economy of illegally imported Skylines. Customs agents became experts at spotting GTR badges, and countless cars were crushed after being seized at ports. It wasn't until the 25-year import rule allowed the R32 GTR into America legally that enthusiasts finally got their hands on Godzilla. By then, an entire generation of American car enthusiasts had grown up worshiping an engine they'd only experienced in video games. Number 6. The turbine that nearly broke racing. The Pratt Whitney ST6 turbine engine remains the most radical power plant ever to lap the Indianapolis 500. And it was so threatening to the establishment that officials essentially legislated it out of existence. In 1967, Parnelli Jones nearly won the Indy 500 in a turbine-powered car before a transmission bearing failed with just 3 laps to go. The racing world was shaken to its core. This wasn't just another engine, it was a complete paradigm shift. The ST6 produced around 550 horsepower, but horsepower numbers don't tell the turbine story. What mattered was the torque delivery. Instant, seamless, and continuous from idle to redline. No gear changes needed because turbines don't need transmissions like piston engines. Drivers just press the throttle and experience smooth, relentless acceleration. The sound was different too, a high-pitched whine instead of the traditional roar of pistons. Fans hated it. More importantly, traditional engine builders were terrified. If turbines took over, centuries of piston engine development would become worthless overnight. After Andy Granatelli's turbines dominated again in 1968, USAC moved swiftly. They limited air intake area, effectively strangling the turbine's power advantage. Then came fuel consumption limits that turbines couldn't meet efficiently. By 1970, the rules were so restrictive that turbine cars couldn't compete. The technology that could have revolutionized motorsports was regulated into extinction. The bitter irony? Modern Formula One cars use hybrid systems that recover energy from turbines. The sport eventually came full circle, just 50 years too late for the original turbine pioneers. Number 5. The Mystery Motor Conspiracy. In 1963, Chevrolet showed up to Daytona with a secret weapon that would become one of the most controversial engines in NASCAR history. The Mark the Sun mystery motor was a 427 cubic inch big block that nobody outside GM knew existed. When Junior Johnson's Chevrolet lapped the field in qualifying, Ford and Chrysler executives demanded to see under the hood. What they found sent shockwaves through Detroit. This wasn't an evolution of Chevy's existing 409. It was an entirely new design with revolutionary cylinder heads. The valve arrangement, later known as the porcupine design due to the angled valve stems, provided superior breathing and combustion efficiency. Power output was rumored to exceed 500 horsepower, astronomical for 1963. Chevy dominated Daytona, but their celebration was short-lived. GM's corporate leadership, already nervous about government antitrust scrutiny, ordered all factory racing support terminated immediately. The mystery motor disappeared from NASCAR as quickly as it had arrived. But here's where the story gets interesting. NASCAR's homologation rules required manufacturers to sell production versions of race engines. Since the mystery motor was never offered to the public, it became retroactively illegal. Chevy couldn't race it without selling it, and GM wouldn't let them sell it. The engine that could have dominated NASCAR for years was killed by corporate politics. The technology didn't die, though. The mystery motor's DNA lived on in the 396 and 427 big blocks that powered countless muscle cars. Every LS engine today can trace its valve arrangement back to that banned motor. In trying to kill the mystery motor, GM accidentally created the blueprint for the next 60 years of V8 development. Number 4. When big blocks became outlaws. NASCAR's relationship with big block engines reads like a bitter divorce. Throughout the 1960s and early 1970s, the horsepower wars had escalated to absurd levels. Factory teams were showing up with 500-plus cubic inch monsters that made 700-plus horsepower. The 1970 Plymouth Superbird and Dodge Daytona, with their massive wings and swooping nose cones, were hitting $200 MPs on superspeedways. Then came the 1973 oil crisis, and suddenly NASCAR had a public relations nightmare. How could they justify racing gas-guzzling behemoths while Americans waited in fuel lines? The answer was a gradual strangling of big block power. First came restrictor plates at superspeedways, literally choking airflow into the engines. Then displacement limits started shrinking. By the mid-1970s, anything over 358 cubic inches was effectively banned through a complex system of weight penalties and restrictions. Teams tried everything to circumvent the rules. They'd acid-dip blocks to remove weight, use exotic materials, and play games with measurement procedures. NASCAR inspectors became like forensic scientists, tearing down engines and measuring every component. The death blow came in the 1980s when NASCAR mandated the 358 cubic inch limit still in place today. The thunderous big blocks that had defined American racing were extinct. Modern NASCAR engines make more power than those old big blocks, but they do it through 9,000 RPM and advanced technology rather than sheer displacement. The primal appeal of a 500 cubic inch engine that shook the ground was gone forever. Veterans still talk about the real NASCAR when engines were measured in fractions of a liter and cars actually resembled what you could buy at a dealership. Number 3. The Evolution Revolution denied. Mitsubishi's 4G63 turbo engine powered the Evolution to legendary status everywhere except America. While the rest of the world was enjoying rally-bred AWD turbo sedans in the early 1990s, Americans were stuck watching grainy videos and playing Gran Turismo. The engine itself was a tuner's dream, an iron block that could handle enormous boost, a sophisticated turbo system, and Mitsubishi's advanced engine management. In Evolution trim, it made 276 horsepower officially, but like all Japanese performance cars of the era, that was a gentleman's agreement lie. Real output was closer to 300, and with minor modifications, 400 horsepower was easily achievable. The problem wasn't the engine's capability, it was America's regulatory environment. The 4G63 and Evolution spec couldn't meet U.S. emissions requirements without extensive modifications. The high-boost turbo setup produced NOx levels that exceeded EPA limits. California's CARB standards were even stricter, essentially making the car impossible to certify for the largest car market in America. Mitsubishi faced a choice: spend millions developing a U.S.-specific version of the Evolution with different engine management, catalytic converters, and boost levels, or just skip America entirely. For over a decade, they chose option 2. American enthusiasts were forced to lust after JDM Evolutions while making do with naturally aspirated Eclipses. When Mitsubishi finally brought the Evolution 8 to America in 2003, they had to detune the engine and add extensive emissions equipment. The U.S. version made less power, revved lower, and ran more conservative boost. It was still fantastic, but everyone knew the JDM version was the real deal. The cruel irony is that by the time America got the Evolution, its competitors had already evolved beyond it. The regulatory delays meant American enthusiasts missed the Evolution's golden years. And before our final engine, don't forget to hit subscribe for more automotive content and comment below if you knew any of these banned power plants. Number 2. The European Missile Crisis. BMW's S38 and M88 inline-6 engines represent perhaps the greatest performance disparity between European and American specifications. These high-rev and naturally aspirated sixes were engineering masterworks, but American buyers got neutered versions that barely resembled their European counterparts. The European S38B38 and the E34 M5 made 335 horsepower and screamed to 7,200 RPM. Individual throttle bodies fed each cylinder, and the engine note was pure mechanical symphony. But when BMW prepared the engine for America, the lawyers and regulators got involved. Out went the individual throttle bodies, replaced by a single throttle body to meet emissions requirements. Compression dropped from 10.5 on 1 to 9.8.1. The rev limit was lowered to 6,900 RPM to reduce emissions and improve catalyst life. Power dropped to 310 horsepower, but the real loss was in character. The European engine was a high-strung thoroughbred that demanded to be revved. The American version felt comparatively lazy, with less urgent throttle response and a muted exhaust note. BMW claimed the changes were necessary to meet emission standards, but enthusiasts suspected it was really about reliability and warranty claims in the lawsuit-happy American market. The situation was even worse with earlier versions. The M88-3 and the European M6 made 286 horsepower, while Americans got a different engine entirely, the S38B35 with just 256 horsepower. That's a 30 horsepower deficit in a car that cost more than a house. Gray market importers made fortunes bringing over European spec cars and attempting to federalize them. Most failed emissions testing spectacularly. The few that passed commanded massive premiums. Today, European spec S38 engines are holy grails for BMW enthusiasts. Swapping one into a U.S. car requires dealing with engine management, emissions equipment, and potentially illegal modifications. The fact that Americans had to break laws to get the engines BMW originally designed shows how broken the regulatory system had become. Number 1. The Can-Am Killer. The Porsche 91730 remains the most powerful racing car ever banned from American competition, and its prohibition essentially killed an entire racing series. When Mark Donohue climbed into the 91730 for the 1973 Can-Am season, he wasn't driving a race car. He was piloting a guided missile with license plates. The twin-turbocharged flat 12 engine produced 1,580 horsepower in qualifying trim. Let that sink in. In 1973, when a good street car made 200 horsepower, Porsche built a 1,580 horsepower monster. The turbochargers were the size of garbage cans. Boost pressure could exceed 40 psi. The engine consumed fuel so quickly that the car needed a 58-gallon fuel tank just to finish a race. Donohue didn't just win races, he annihilated the competition. At Road Atlanta, he qualified 4.9 seconds faster than second place. At Mid-Ohio, he lapped the entire field, twice. The other teams didn't even bother showing up for some races. What was the point? The 91730 had turned Can-Am into the Porsche parade. SCCA officials watched their premier series dying and acted desperately. For 1974, they implemented a 3-mile-per-gallon fuel consumption rule specifically targeting the thirsty turbocharged engines. It was a transparent attempt to ban the Porsche without actually naming it. The rules worked too well. Not only did they eliminate the 91730, they killed the entire Can-Am series. Without the spectacular turbocharged monsters, fans lost interest. The series limped along for a few more years before dying entirely. Porsche parked the 91730 after its dominant 1973 season, undefeated and unbowed. The most powerful racing engine ever built was legislated out of existence because it was simply too good. Today, the surviving 91730s are priceless museum pieces, reminders of when racing cars were limited only by physics and bravery, not rule books. The engine that was too powerful for America ended up being too powerful for racing itself.